All right, this video is going to deal with sewing a piped seam. So you've got your piece of piping that you created in the last exercise, and now you're going to put it in a seam. For the purposes of this, you're going to want 2 pieces of muslin. These are samples. They are 10 inches by 3.5 inches. You want your pieces of muslin, you want your piece of piping, you're going to need some pins. You may need a ruler and a pencil. Now, here's why. You see this flange? This is what we use to sew this 2 things. If you're sewing it into a 1/2 inch seam, you probably want it to be a 1/2 inch so that you can line it up. In my case, mine's 5/8 of an inch. So for the purposes of ease for this video, we're gonna sew a 5/8 inch seam or whatever matches your piping. But know that if you needed a 1/2 inch seam, you're gonna wanna trim this out to a 1/2 inch. To do that, you'd take your ruler, you'd get a line. See this line here with my stitching is lined up at my 1/2 inch line, and I'd take my pencil and I'd draw what I needed to cut off, and I could trim that away. Hopefully that'll make sense. But for purposes of ease, we're gonna use what we've got here. I've got 5/8, you might wanna measure your piece. But it's a 2-step process. First, you wanna sew it to one side, and then you wanna sew it to the other. So to do the first side, we're gonna lay it in like this. Put your raw edges together. This is how we're gonna sew this. And you're going to put some pins in here to hold things together. You need to pin through both layers of your flange on your piping and your substrate piece of muslin, what you're sewing it to. Now, excuse me, you're gonna need to use a few pins, because as you put this through the machine, the presser foot's gonna push up against here, and in between these pins, it can make this bow out. So until you're very good at advanced sewing, you wanna keep this good and still by using as many pins as you possibly can. So take your time pinning, make sure you've got it good and set up the way you'd like. I'm gonna use a few more in here, and then we're gonna take it to the machine. One more. And again, you're still gonna be using the zipper foot on this. Now that I've got this all pinned up, I'm gonna put it through the machine. You can orient it however you'd like. If you wanna put it through your machine this way, set your zipper foot up that way. If you wanna put it through your machine this way, set your zipper foot up there. But here we go, if you look at it. I'm just gonna do kind of the same thing I did when I actually made the piping. My thread is all kinds of tangled around this presser foot. Hold on. There we go. All right. So first things first, we're gonna start up here at the top of our fabric and start attaching this. And you are gonna wanna backstitch. Again, it's a 3 stitch length. And it looks like I'm pretty good. I'll drop this needle just to see. I like it, and we're gonna go. Now, something you wanna keep in mind is you wanna get close to this stitching, because if you're not sewing on this side of that stitching, it'll show in your seam. So we wanna get good and in there. This is a case for not making your piping so perfectly tight like I did. You see how I'm kind of right up against that stitch line? And you just keep going like that. If the stitch line that you're putting in right now sits on top of the stitching that closes your piping, you're doing pretty good. That won't be seen. So I've attached this to that piece of muslin. Let's see how it looks. I did pretty good on the sewing. Let's pull our pins out and see. All right, this is in good shape. See how my piping is attached to that now? Now the next step of this is to lay the other piece and do the same thing. This involves a little more of y'all's favorite, the blind sewing. And this one's just a little more cumbersome because you've got this chonky piece of piping kind of pushing things out of your way. I'm trimming my threads so I can see a little better. I encourage you to do this at all times. Y'all know how I feel about stray threads on projects. They do affect your grade because you'd never send anything out into the world with stray threads in it. It's not a very professional look. We want to be professionals. So Here we are. I'm ready to sew this next side on. And we're gonna do the same thing we just did. You're gonna lay your raw edges together. And you're gonna sew. But make sure you're lining up your top and your bottom, right? Now you see how this has a little ridge in it? It can make things a little tricky. So you gotta kind of control and hold things down and in place right when you're pinning. Again, I say it all the time. If you're not pinning things in the right place, you're not helping yourself. You'll also notice that I'm not running my pins past the piping. Kind of like the zipper feet, I don't want it sitting up at that weird angle by crossing over the piping. What you can do though, since this is cotton cording, you can just kind of run your pin into it, but I don't recommend it. Just keep it clear, it's easier. Get these pins set in here, and then you just sew like you did the last time, using the presser or the zipper foot to push up against that edge. I got one more pin to stick in. Sorry for all the vibrations, everybody. Still waiting on my fancy crane to come back. All right, but this is a case of second verse or third, same as the first. I'm gonna do a little bit to push my piping out of the way here. And we're gonna drop this presser foot down in place and drop our needle and make sure it's where we like it. Looks good, and I'm gonna sew. Here we go, y'all. Don't forget to backstitch. And with this one, since you have been secured by sewing it to the bottom piece, you can put a little pressure on this side, on this ridge of the piping, of the cording, because it's not gonna go anywhere. It can't gap between the pins because it got sewn down in place. You don't wanna push too hard though and run up on the gap. You don't wanna start sewing through your cord. So, you know, like with a lot of sewing, this is just walking a fine line, a little marriage of a little part A, a little part B. Working on that finesse, always working on the finesse of sewing. It takes years to get it, but I know you all can. That is a piped seam that I just sewed. Let's take it apart and see how it looks. All right, there's the sewn side. There's the other sewn side, and let's open it up and see how we did. Look at that, everybody. It is a piped seam. That is how you insert piping into a seam. Now when you press this, you'll have to decide what you're pressing open. Chances are you'll want to press all the bias to one side. You don't need to necessarily split that bias tape open. But your seam allowances, you can kind of press it like this. It may be beneficial to press from the front some too, to get it nice, to lay nice and flat. But there you go, that's a piped seam.